The Taronar 45mm f2.8 was the lens that came with Taron PR, a fixed-lens rangefinder camera that was made for only a few years in the late 1950s. Taron was a Japanese company whose original name was Nippon Kosoki Seisakusho. In the 1940s and early 50s, they specialized in the manufacturing of shutters for medium-format folding cameras. In 1955, they released their first 35mm rangefinder camera, which they named Taron, but the company continued to be called Nippon Kosoki. 4 years later, in 1959, they decided to rebrand themselves by adapting the name of their rangefinder cameras and became Taron Company Limited. Taron lasted only a few years after that and vanished completely sometime in the late 1960s. I found a non-working copy of the Taron PR on eBay for only $15. This lens accepts filters with 46mm diameter. The aperture is clickless and ranges from f2.8 to f16. The diaphragm is made of 8 rounded aperture blades. On the back, this lens is a bit different. After I removed it from the Taron PR, it had no mount and no focusing helicoid, but adapting it to Sony mirrorless is very easy. I used an M25 to M42 adapter and an M42 to NEX 17 to 31mm focusing helicoid. First, I screwed the adapter to the back of the lens, just like so, and once that was done, I attached it to the focusing helicoid and I was ready to use it on my Sony camera. This lens weighs 233 grams, and that includes the adapter and the focusing helicoid. When this lens was part of the Taron PR, it had a minimum focusing distance of 1 meter. But when adapted to Sony mirrorless in the way I just described, the minimum focusing distance shrinks down to only 30 centimeters. The Taronar 45mm f2.8 is an amazing little lens. Even though it does not have a fancy brand name or fast maximum aperture, it is an incredible performer that kept surprising me over and over with its fantastic image quality and unique rendering. Wide open or stopped down, this lens never disappoints. At f2.8, it's already sharp in the center with an out-of-focus blur that is as smooth as can be. I personally love the way this lens renders out of focus areas because everything looks buttery soft with a kind of painterly quality that is very unique to this lens. The bokeh bows that this Taronar produces are also quite unique, with hard-edged circles for most of the frame becoming more oval-like towards the corners. When it comes to sharpness, this lens is also pretty special. The images that it produces are definitely sharp, but never clinical. Even when stopped down to f8, which is when the lens reaches peak performance, the images still have a very pleasing quality without being too harsh. In a way, they remind me of photographs from magazines in the 60s and the 70s, which I personally love. The colors that come out of this Taronar are also great. They're rich and vibrant, with very nice contrast and beautiful tones. Amazingly, this lens has no issues with chromatic aberrations. I didn't see any fringing at all, no matter what I decided to photograph. Really impressive for a lens from the 1950s. When it comes to distortion, this lens also scores very highly with only a hint of barrel distortion that is hardly noticeable. Flare is also extremely well controlled. I was actually amazed that I had no issues with flare even when I was shooting straight towards the sun. Build quality, as you can expect from a Japanese lens that was made in the 1950s, is top-notch. All metal construction with beautifully machined parts and super sturdy feel. This lens is also very tiny and lightweight, which makes it a great companion for many shooting situations. The only issue I noticed with this lens is some oil on the aperture blades, which I discovered when I removed it from the camera. I managed to wipe that off and the lens works fine now, but if you're looking for this lens, beware of this issue because oily aperture blades seem to be quite common with this model. But besides that, this lens is absolutely amazing. Even though it cost me only $15 and it came from a broken rangefinder from the 1950s with a brand name that almost no one's ever heard of, this lens does so many things very well. I'm personally blown away by how good this Taronar lens is, and I can highly recommend it to anyone who wants a great vintage lens with tons of positive qualities. And for those of you who are curious how this lens performs when it comes to video, here's a little clip that I shot at f8 of a tiny slug that I found on the forest floor. As you can see, once again, excellent performance by the Taronar 45mm f2.8. For those of you who would like to try this lens, I put together a few notes that can help you out with the adapting process. The first thing to do once you get yourself a Taron PR rangefinder camera is to open up the film door. Inside the film door, you'll notice the retaining ring that holds the lens in place. There are 2 notches on the ring. Grab a lens spanner wrench and unscrew the retaining ring. As soon as the ring is unscrewed, the lens simply comes out. There are no wires or anything else that you need to worry about. Once you have the lens, you'll need to make sure that it's set to bulb mode. After that, grab a flathead screwdriver and remove the spacer that's on the back of the lens. When that is done, you'll notice the 2 protruding rods on the back. One is the shutter release lever and the other the shutter cocking spindle. My copy of this lens came with a non-functional shutter that was already open, so I can't show you this next step on my lens, but if you have a normal working shutter, this is what you'll need to do. Grab some pliers and turn the shutter cocking spindle clockwise until you hear a little click. Then push the shutter release lever to the left and hold it in place. Then insert some crumpled piece of paper in the gap and your shutter will stay open. Now you can use the lens just like any other normal lens. And the final step before you can adapt this Taronar lens is to get rid of the shutter release lever and the shutter cocking spindle. This way you'll have enough clearance to screw the M25 adapter. I used just some strong pliers that had no problem cutting through both of them. And when that is all done, screw the M25 adapter in place, attach that to the helicoid, and you have yourself an awesome little vintage lens. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time here at Vintage Optics.